I mean, you're the only American to have commanded 5 spaceflight missions, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. You have to be well rested and mentally alert when you climb on top of that rocket the next day to make sure you don't make any mistakes. Can you do that under the threat of fires, computer failures, any number of electrical failures or things that can happen that can cause a 100-ton vehicle to smash into a 200-ton space station and kill everybody instantly. So you have to be able to perform under that kind of mental anxiety or stress. We called it balance confidence with humility. You know, you can't sit on top of a launch pad on 4.5 million pounds of explosive energy and propellant without being really confident. You have to have confidence to do the job. If something bad starts to happen and this vehicle starts coming apart, I'm going to spend my last seconds of life trying to save, in priority order, the crew, the vehicle, and the mission.
And we're rolling. So thanks a lot for joining me today.
My pleasure to be here with you, Ray.
Awesome, man. So for anyone who doesn't know, tell me a bit about your background. So you were a NASA astronaut, right?
Yes, I had the great fortune of doing the only thing I've ever wanted to do since I was 10 years old, and that is to fly in space. I don't remember much before I was 10, but suddenly when I was 10 years old, I decided that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be an astronaut and fly in space. And I feel, as I say, very fortunate that I was able to do that.
That's amazing. I also wanted to be an astronaut when I was a child. I said to myself, I would be an astronaut or a farmer, but I ended up becoming a teacher. So
Okay.
yeah, good job in actually making your childhood dream come true. But
Yeah.
what does someone have to do to become an astronaut?
So great question, but let me pause and mention, since you were a teacher, one of the great inspirations of my childhood, I was in, I think, the 4th or 5th grade, and I smuggled into class a 9-volt transistor radio to listen to one of the Mercury flights and with the astronauts in space, and I got caught. And I thought I was in big trouble, but rather the teacher said, Mrs. Johnson was her name. She said, okay, you sit in the back here. And she put a map of the world and gave me a bunch of thumbtacks. And she said, keep listening and plot the progress as they fly around the Earth. So I thought I was part of the space program. So I was
That's
very
amazing.
inspired by that. She was a wonderful teacher. As I grew older.
Sorry, what age were you at that point?
Sorry?
What age was that? What age were you when you?
I was probably 10 years old. It was right when I
so you were
first
young.
had decided that's what I wanted to do.
Well, did you
by
put
the
that
way,
in your...
by the way, I didn't decide that's what I wanted to do. I really decided that's what I'm going to do. You know, when you're a 10-year-old naive kid, that was what I was going to do. As I grew older, I realized, well, there's not much chance. But I never really lost sight of the dream, and I always did the next step possible on the journey. Not necessarily with the ultimate goal to become an astronaut, but just because the next step I thought would be fun. So I decided to go to college, and I wanted to study aerospace engineering because that really intrigued me. When I graduated college, I didn't want to get a real job or a desk job, so I joined the U.S. Navy to learn how to fly on aircraft carriers. And then I became a test pilot in the US Navy. And then I suddenly realized I had enough experience to apply to NASA, fully expecting to not be selected. But I was very pleasantly surprised that I was selected on my first attempt and joined NASA in 1984.
That is amazing. So that was just a straight journey from childhood of just, you had the goal of being an astronaut and it was just constant steps after step after step of getting towards that goal. Did you ever waver from that goal, or was it?
No, I never wavered from the goal, but I realized, as I say, when I got older, there's not much chance of ever doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But that never stopped me from doing the next step.
Sure.
And I always, I tell school age children these days who ask, you must find your passion. And my passion was anything to do with space or aviation. So that's why I studied aerospace engineering. Had I not become an astronaut or even a pilot, I would have been an aerospace engineer because I loved it. That's what we should do is find our passion. I've often told my children I've never worked a day in my life, and they pay me good money to go have fun and do things that I think are exhilarating.
Amazing. So, see, when you got that job at NASA, what was that first job? Was that astronaut, or did you have to still work up to being an astronaut?
You must work up to it. I was selected technically they call it an astronaut candidate. We go through a 2-year period of observation. We have different collateral duties or ground jobs. We do a lot of studying and simulating and flying. And they just observe how we perform and whether or not we're good individually, but also more importantly, are we good as a team? Can we be a good team player and make the team better by the function of our skills? The first job I had, I was very fortunate. I was a Capcom, so that stands for capsule communicator. I was the person to speak to the astronauts who were in space, and it required extensive technical knowledge of the system and also a great understanding of the operations of each mission. So that was a wonderful opportunity, even though I had never flown in space, to learn about the business of flying in space.
Incredible, incredible. So, after how long was it that you found out that that childhood dream is going to come true and you actually get to go to space?
So, if I may, it was about 6 years, but there was a reason for that. It would have been 2 or 3 years, but we of course had the Challenger disaster in 1986. I was accepted at NASA in 84, so I had been there for 2 years, and suddenly the program ground to a halt from a flight perspective, and then the job was to figure out what happened and how to avoid such tragic consequences in the future. And that took several years. And so I learned in, I think, 1989 that I would fly. I was selected to fly at the end of 89, and the mission ended up being in early 1990 to go retrieve a satellite that was in a decaying orbit. So that was pretty exciting.
And how do you do that? How do you retrieve a satellite? What does that mean in a decaying orbit? Does that mean it's coming closer to the Earth?
Yes, everything that's in space in low Earth orbit or even in higher orbits will be decaying or descending, decelerating, and therefore descending. Even in space, if you're 250 miles above the surface of the Earth, there still is a very thin, tenuous atmosphere. So there's molecules of oxygen that bombard any vehicle and tend to slow it down over time. So this satellite was in about a 250 mile orbit, but it was there for 6 years and it has no propulsion. And so it was gradually decaying in a lower and lower orbit. It was about 90 miles when we retrieved it. Had it been left in space for another month or two, it would have entered the very top part of the atmosphere and deorbited. It would have crashed down to the surface of the Earth, somewhere on the Earth between the latitudes of 28.5 degrees north and 28.5 degrees south. So it would have hit somewhere on the Earth. So our job was to go and recover that satellite and bring it back down to space, or bring it back down to Earth from space.
So how do you retrieve a satellite that's moving at that speed?
So we took the space shuttle to that same orbit. Dan Brandestein was the commander and I was the pilot. So I was the second in command on the mission. And we perform a maneuver called a rendezvous, a sequence of maneuvers called a rendezvous, to enter its exact orbit and try to match our velocity and our altitude and our in-plane velocity and just fly up next to it. Similar kind of a thing that we do in airplanes when we join another airplane in flight and fly formation flight. You may have seen the Blue Angels doing those kinds of things. The only difference is we're flying at 17,500 miles an hour, and we try to match that velocity of the satellite. And Dan Brandestein did a great job, flew up next to the satellite, and then Bonnie Dunbar used the Canadian-built crane remote manipulator system and latched onto it and then pulled it back down into the payload bay.
What's it like?
So it was pretty exciting. And we were...
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I was going to answer your next question.
Yeah.
So traveling that fast, we're only 90, I say only 90 miles. Typically we're up at 250, but now we're only 90 miles. And the lower you are, actually the faster the orbital velocity. And so we were really smoking over the ground, and it was pretty eye-watering to see the Earth going by. For other technical reasons, for safety, we had to rendezvous from above and come down below. And so Dan's job was very difficult because he's looking at the satellite as we're flying over top, trying to come down to it. But all he sees is this beautiful scenery of the Earth just blowing by so fast. It was unbelievable.
Wow.
And you really have to concentrate to make sure with the mental discipline to observe the satellite and not be distracted by the scenes of the Earth going by. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, sure. It sounds like the kind of job where a lot of different things could go wrong.
Yes, and that's exactly the big distinction between, or the importance of, or the ability to be an astronaut. I've often told people I could take any person with average skills into the simulator and talk them through the procedures of docking with the International Space Station successfully.
Wow.
But the trick is, the technique is, can you do that under the threat of fires, computer failures, maneuvering jet failures, stuck on thrusters, navigation systems that go awry, accelerometers that fail, any number of electrical failures or things that can happen that can cause a 100-ton vehicle to smash into a 200-ton space station and kill everybody instantly. So you have to be able to perform under that kind of mental anxiety or stress, to anticipate many dozens of failures, and then when you have a single failure, take the right actions, but then be ready for the next failure. And the more failures you have, the more complex the solution becomes. And to anticipate that many different failures, the possible scenarios just explode in your brain, and it's hard to keep track of all of that. But that was one of the things I loved about the job, was the mental aspect of flying in space. You mentioned a couple of weeks ago when you asked for this interview that you wanted to talk about things like the mentality or the brain processes that go on. And so that's an interesting conversation that we can have.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think this is kind of the topic of your book, right? You talk about managing all of those things that could go wrong and those problems. But I suppose a really big part of that is, how do you mitigate that stress? like when you're in the pressure of that moment, because so many things can go wrong, how do you stop yourself from getting into, let's say, analysis paralysis or becoming overwhelmed with the situation?
So that's a great question. Let me show the book if I could. So, Controlling Risk in a Dangerous World. I make the distinction of between managing risk, which is what most companies do through their executive teams and the management teams, and controlling risk, which is what the frontline workforce does when they pick up the toolbox and go into the oil patch, or they work on an airplane, or they're flying an airplane, or maybe they're a surgeon in an operating room. They have to control risk. And so there's a subtle but very important distinction between managing risk and controlling risk. If I may back up and say, the first thing to think about, if I think about the most elemental aspects of any job, to do anything well requires three things. The trainers call it the KSAs: knowledge, skill, and attitude. So you have to have the proper knowledge of what to do, understand the systems, et cetera. You have to have the skill to be able to execute or put into practice that knowledge. If you're a surgeon, you have to have the skill of opening up a body and performing surgery on an open heart. But much more importantly, the most important of the three is the mental attitude, the discipline required to do the very thing that you're talking about. How do you avoid analysis paralysis? How do you stay mentally focused? And that's a journey that I find most companies do not teach. They do teach knowledge in the classroom, and then most companies offer skill building in either a simulator, as the case of NASA, or on-the-job training and practice. If you're a pipe fitter or you're a plumber, you practice on the job and you develop the skill. But very few companies and very few professions actually help us improve the mental attitude. And so that's the basis of your question, which I haven't begun to answer yet, but but we can if you want. That is, in fact, the most important of the three, is the mental attitude.
Yeah, sure. So what was that like for you? Did NASA guide you at all in that mental attitude, or is this a philosophy that you've built yourself?
Yeah, so they do evaluate and assess the mental attitude, yes, but what they didn't do was to teach or train or give us the ability to develop the proper mental attitude. Companies never do that, and I think they should, and that is the basis of the book. So let me back up and say, I began to learn right after college, when I joined the US Navy to fly, and I had no previous flight experience. I began to understand the importance of mental attitude, and here's how it kind of went. I knew the organization was going to expect me to pretty soon to fly a Navy airplane, and I had never had any previous flight experience. Well, I learned there was a thing called a simulator where we could go and practice, and the organization, the Navy, was going to give me 6 flights in the simulator before I ever flew the first time. And I thought, well, that's not enough for me to learn how to fly an airplane.
It doesn't sound like a lot.
Yeah, so I became friends with the night shift janitor in the simulator building, and he allowed me to sneak into the building at 1:30 in the morning each night for a couple of weeks straight, and I would practice surreptitiously in the simulator, unbeknownst to the organization, and I ended up with 6 times as many hours as my contemporaries by the time I flew the first time. And that was part of my mental attitude, which has stuck with me ever since then. I've always done much more than the organization requires to develop the knowledge, to practice the skill. And so let me tell you one other quick example. I was coming down, this was a couple of years later, so now I'm a Navy pilot flying in the Mediterranean on a dark and stormy night. That's how these stories always start. It was a dark and stormy night. Ships moving around. And I'm coming down to land at night, and I could hear the other pilots' voices going up a couple of octaves as you know, people were getting pretty scared because it was a pretty dangerous night. And I was a 24-year-old, highly confident young naval aviator, and what I learned later that night was my confidence had begun to outrun my actual capabilities. So I was overconfident. I thought I was the best in the world at this, and I was coming down to land on the ship, and I remember thinking, this is the best job in the world. I'm having such a good, this is what I was born to do. I was born to fly. And I was thinking about things like my brother back in New York. He had a lousy job. He was a golf pro, and here I was flying in an airplane. And about the time I crossed the ramp to a hard landing, unfortunately, I didn't damage any hardware. The only thing that was damaged was my psyche, which was pretty well destroyed. I realized for the first time I had done this to myself. Sometimes the hazards are not in the external environment. Sometimes they're inside my helmet. And when I should have been focusing on the task, I wasn't. I was allowing my mind to wander. So I sat there on the flight deck for 10 minutes, unable to unstrap. I was shaking so badly. And I told myself, you did this to yourself. And I promised, I vowed I would develop the mental discipline required to stay focused on the job at hand and not let outside distractions cause me to think about other things other than the operations at hand. And so it was a process of about 8 years until I was sitting on the launch pad for my first launch attempt in January of 1990 to develop that kind of focus of attention to the task and not let other distractions invade my thinking, and just have the mental discipline to stay focused. And the organization didn't really help, but with techniques. But that is eventually why I wrote the book on the techniques of operating excellence. So it's 30 techniques that we used and developed over the years at NASA to stay focused on the job at hand. The first 15 are sort of, any organization is a socio-technical system. There's the social side of an organization, there's the technical side of an organization, and the first 15 of the 30 are technical. They're all mental attitudes, but the first 15 are kind of technical attitudes, and the second 15 are sort of social attitudes on how we maintain the proper discipline to execute well, avoid all potential accidents, and execute the mission. Sorry, that was kind of a long answer to explain.
No, well, it was an excellent answer. It was really an excellent answer. There's a lot of different things I could ask you about going on your answer. I think it's excellent that, you weren't necessarily taught that from an agency. It was more so that you had a failure, and in that failure there was a lot of wisdom that came from it. It gave you a lot of time to reflect, and what I liked is you took the responsibility, and I think that's a real sign of maturity, when you don't blame the outside, when you actually take responsibility for your mistakes, and you realize that the problem was your excess of confidence, and you had humility in coming up with a solution, and that wisdom, I think, is continues you on to be so successful in your field. I mean, you're the only American to have commanded 5 spaceflight missions, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And I firmly believe half of that is luck, being in the right place at the right time, but the other half is being prepared. So when I first arrived at as I observed other astronauts, it occurred to me that, and we had, I think, about 85 other astronauts at that time. By the time I was the director of flight operations responsible for all the astronauts, we had 150 astronauts. But when I was young and new, so I was about 32 years old, I think, and I was looking around, it occurred to me that almost all of the other astronauts were worried about the wrong thing. They were trying to anticipate the politics of the situation. How do I get assigned to a mission? The big important reward for an astronaut is assignment to a mission. We don't do it for money or anything else. It's getting assigned to a mission. And most of the other astronauts, in my opinion, were too worried about, how do I look good in front of the boss? How do I go to happy hour with the boss, or play on the softball team with the boss to get selected. And I thought that was a wasted mental energy and effort. I thought, the best way to get assigned to a mission is to keep my head down, study the books, practice in the simulator. I still have, the other record I'm very proud of is I have more time in the simulator than any other astronaut.
Wow.
So you do the job, you do the work, you become really smart, really good at what you do. And then the politics don't matter. They have to assign you to a mission if you know more about the systems than anyone else, and you can execute under the threat of fire or, other bad things that can happen.
Amazing.
And so I think that kind of worked. The other big success story, I think, or message is, if you are willing to, and you not just willing to, you have to really believe this. When we come back from a mission, if I'm the commander, any success gets attributed to the team because they're the ones that created the success. And any failures that we have, that was my responsibility as a commander because I failed to help the team execute properly. And if you have that kind of an attitude, then I think the executives and the bosses making decisions want you to fly more missions.
Because of the ability to accept responsibility, because you accept responsibility.
Yes. Yeah. And that became one of the techniques. In fact, it's the first of the social side techniques and you alluded to it earlier, we called it balance confidence with humility. You can't sit on top of a launch pad on 4.5 million pounds of explosive energy and propellant without being really confident. You have to have confidence to do the job, but you also have to have the humility to recognize I can make mistakes, and how do I prevent making mistakes? How do I really do this job well? And it's that's another thing I see lacking in so many companies. If you look at executives in companies, they'll often show an awful lot of confidence, but they rarely show any kinds of humility. And that's what people want to see, is a balance of confidence with humility. I say, if you don't have confidence, you'll make many mistakes. If you don't have humility, you won't realize you're making mistakes, and so you won't do anything to prevent them.
That's an amazing line. I'm going to write that down. I think that's an excellent line. A great piece of wisdom. And next question for you is, when you went from being a pilot for the, transitioning from a normal pilot to then piloting a space shuttle, what's the difference in that like? Is that quite a formidable change? What was that transition like for you?
So I think there were many similarities and also a couple of differences. One similarity is if you're flying solo in A7, for example, on the USS Kennedy in the Mediterranean at night, when you cross the ramp, you are 14 feet plus or minus 2 feet hooked to ramp, and you're seconds from immediate death if you make a bad mistake. And you're dead no matter what, even though you're alone and most of the world is not going to know about it. Years later, when you become an astronaut, you are also seconds from death if you make a bad mistake. And in that case, the whole world will know about it. But nonetheless, you're dead. And by the way, the most common fear an astronaut has is not a fear of death, it's a fear of making a mistake. That's what drives us to really essentially be as good as we can be, is we don't want to let our peers down. I don't want to let my crew members down. There's another story I tell about the job of being an astronaut is almost always exhilaration, fun, professional satisfaction, all the good things you can think about it. But there are rare occasions when the reality of the job kind of hits you between the eyes, and it's a rather sobering experience. And so one of those occasions is the night before your first launch attempt, when your head hits the pillow and you've suddenly realized you've run out of time to get any smarter and it's too late to quit. And you have to be able to deal with that and try to get a good night's sleep, because you have to be well rested and mentally alert when you climb on top of that rocket the next day to make sure you don't make any mistakes. So I had to think to myself, as I'm trying to get to sleep, how am I going to deal with this? You know, we could die tomorrow in a fiery explosion. Well, my first thought was, this is the only thing I've ever wanted to do since I was 10 years old. Comforting feeling, but it's not sufficient, because I could still die, and that's not what I wanted to do since I was 10 years old. So I had to think a little deeper. And it occurred to me after about 20 minutes of thinking and rationalizing and trying to, think about this, I realized tomorrow morning, if I climb on that vehicle and we're ascending into orbit, if something bad starts to happen and this vehicle starts coming apart, I'm going to spend my last seconds of life trying to save, in priority order, the crew, the vehicle, and the mission. Essentially, I was taking myself out of the equation. Doesn't matter what happens to me, I'm going to save my crew members and then I'll die happy. Or I'm going to try to save the vehicle and the systems so we can fly again another day. Or obviously, if we can save the mission, better yet. But those three things have stuck with me throughout my career. It's always about trying to save your crew members or your buddies or your fellow humans in whatever endeavor you're doing. Even if you're a military soldier in times of war, you're always trying to save your buddies. That's the most important part. And then the systems and the hardware. If you're in an oil company, obviously you don't want to damage the hardware, so you want to keep being able to produce energy. And then finally, the mission is the most important. So, those kind of three things in priority always helped me to not think about the possibility of death. When you climb on a rocket, it's total and complete focus and concentration on the task at hand, and you don't worry about anything farther than about 10 seconds in the future, because none of that matters. The future never comes until later anyway. So I can't do anything about the future. I can only worry about the here and the now. And that kind of focus and being here now on the present gives you this incredible feeling of being able to sense everything, hear everything, see everything, feel everything, think about everything, listen to the voices of the crew members, respond to them if required, or ground control, and execute the mission. So it's a great feeling if you can concentrate so deeply that you're staying in the present. And I use it for other techniques when I give speeches in front of 2,000 people, or I'm playing golf alone over the shot. You focus on the present, stay in the present, and execute the best way you can, and it helps you be successful.
Yeah, that's incredible. So to get that absolute focus on the present, it's similar to like meditation techniques. A lot of like meditation, it's focus on the breath. You put the rest of the world, you put your thoughts on the outside, and you just focus on one single thing, whether it's one part of your body or just your breathing or staring at a flame. Did you learn any kind of meditation techniques, or do you just have your own way of going about this?
Yeah, so it was my own way, born that night that I mentioned, where I almost died, but didn't, on the aircraft carrier, when I realized I had done this to myself, and I vowed to develop the mental discipline to stay focused. I never really read anything. Years later, I did read about Zen and meditation and that kind of thing when I was studying how the brain works, and I began to realize it's almost identical. I have spoken with musicians at the elite level. One of my friends is Max Weinberg, the drummer for this Bruce Springsteen band, the E Street Band.
Oh, wow.
And he and I have had conversations over the years about what's it like to play in front of 85,000 fans in Wembley Stadium or Hyde Park. And you really have to stay in the present. It's almost an identical feeling. You know, he keeps one eye on the boss, Springsteen, because he'll play a different show every night. And he's always thinking about where the boss wants to take the music. But he stays in the present. And if he makes a mistake, you know, those of us who are not at that elite level will never see the mistake or hear the mistake, but he knows he's made a mistake. And he immediately corrects and immediately puts it out of his mind to stay in the present again. And it's the same thing, you know, going uphill on a rocket. It's a very exhilarating feeling. I encourage anybody to use any of the techniques they can come up with that are similar to that, because it gives you kind of what I call supreme confidence. You really feel like you can sense everything, see everything, hear everything, think about everything. If you eliminate other external distractions, you know, as much as I love my family, when I'm on a rocket, they don't exist in my mind. And I've had this conversation with my wife, you know, her job, by the way, was much harder than mine because she had to watch me do these kinds of crazy things throughout my career. But yeah, it's just a wonderful feeling. And I encourage people to try to develop that in whatever field they're in. And then it's like you're not really working for money. You're working for the pleasure and the enjoyment and the satisfaction of mastering whatever it is you're doing. If you're tuning a car engine, you're the best car tuner engine person in the world. And when you're doing it, you're immersed in it and you just love it with a passion that it's just a pleasure to do the job. And, you know, time goes by much more quickly. You don't realize you're working, and you just have fun at whatever you're doing.
That's an amazing answer. Yeah, I suppose it's completely key to just focus and making the most out of something. You know, we've been talking all this time and we haven't even spoken about much about being in space. That's another thing I wanted to talk to you about. So how long have you actually been in space for?
So I had 6 missions and each one was about 2 weeks long. So, you know, a total of about 3 months in space.
Oh.
Just wonderful, you know, and every flight, you must assume that it will be your last. And so you really have to take in, to record mentally, and all the experiences and the sights and the sounds and the feelings, and kind of preserve them. And I almost feel like it's my duty, since I had the privilege of experiencing that, to share the story. So thanks for having me on your show.
It's my
and
pleasure.
being able to tell these stories.
It's my
to
pleasure.
try to give people a sense of what it's like. It's just an unbelievable experience to travel into space and look back down on the Earth and see the kinds of things that we can see.
What's it like, or what was it like the first time you ever went into space and you looked down on the Earth? See me, like I had another record holder on recently, and this guy is a tightrope walker, and he holds a world record for, I think, the highest tightrope walk. And when you watch the video, he's on top of a mountain, and I'm just looking at the drop and watching the video from my bedroom. I'm thinking he needs to be careful, but obviously in space, like. Do you have that feeling of like, I'm really high up? Does such a fear exist? So
let me explain that by saying I do have what I call a healthy fear of heights. Well, it's just not even a fear of heights, it's a fear of falling. And it's not even a fear of falling, it's a fear of the impact after the fall.
Yeah.
But so what I do is I control my safety. I control if I'm in a high place, you know, I make sure I have all the proper safety precautions and I do all the things to make sure I don't fall. Let me back up and say, the first time I launched, you know, I had developed this mental discipline of staying focused and in the present. It was so total and complete that although your brain is recording the emotional experience and the physical sensations and the immense thrust, you're not really thinking about that. You're really concentrating on the technical aspects, the engine performance, the trajectory, the electrical system, and the life support system, all those technical things. It's an incredibly powerful feeling. It's the most sustained straight line power you can experience and come out at the other end alive. It almost feels like it's pressing so hard up at 3 Gs that it feels like somebody's standing on your chest. A bear is compressing your lungs and making it difficult to breathe. But you don't think about any of that. You are recording it and sensing it. So we get to orbit, which takes 8 minutes and 23 seconds from a standing start on the launch pad to orbital velocity. And then there's still about 5 minutes worth of intense operational activities to make sure that the vehicle is in a safe configuration, ready for orbital velocity. So you're still concentrating. And each of my 6 flights, about 13 minutes after launch, when you begin to wind down out of this mental focus and discipline, the first thought I always have is I kind of mentally or figuratively slap myself and say, oh man, what a ride. Respond or think about the physical sensation and the emotional experience and the sights that you can see. The first thing that I saw on my very first mission that just blew my mind was the scene of the moon. It was not a full moon, but it was a nearly full moon. It was so bright and so clear and so amazing. It almost looked like we were much closer to the moon than it looks like down here on the Earth. We're not really that much closer. We're 250 miles closer, but it's 250,000 miles away. So we're only 1,000th closer, but it looked so big and bright because there's no atmosphere and it's as viewed against the blackness of space. And it was so bright and clear, just truly amazing.
Wow.
Years later, I realized, I think that was so amazing to me because nobody prepared me for that expectation of what I was going to see in the moon. They had told me about some of the other great things you can see down on the surface of the Earth. And I often thought I was sight of the moon, or it could have been the Apollo astronauts that inspired me when I was younger. But on each of my successive missions, whenever I was the commander and I flew a rookie, I purposely did not tell them or prepare them for what they were going to see because I wanted them to have that visceral emotional experience themselves. And it was fun to kind of see their eyes just get really big.
Yeah.
Some of the sights of the Earth. On the nighttime side of the Earth, the atmosphere glows a green color. It's the most amazing thing you could ever see. It's not man-made lights or human-made lights or sunlight or even moonlight. The atmosphere is actually glowing. It's a phenomenon called Joule heating, where the photons give off or the electrons give off a single photon when the electron drops down to a lower energy state. And the atmosphere glows green, and it's even brighter green at the top where the atmosphere is very thin. The most amazing thing you could ever imagine. But some of these sights and scenes are just incredible. The nighttime star field that you see, thousands, tens of thousands of stars that you can see with the unaided eye.
Wow.
Not twinkling, all steady points of light, very bright, some very dim, mostly white, some yellowish, some actually brownish, bluish. Didn't see any green ones, but just an amazing of the stars in the galaxy. I mean, it just blows your mind to see these kinds of things. It's unbelievable experience. And then, I didn't even mention the weightlessness and floating around and being able to go up to the ceiling without gravity. And I mean, it's really cool.
So seeing that 2 weeks that you're living up there in space, what's it like going from living on Earth with gravity to then living in space without gravity? What kind of effect does that have on your body? Is it hard to get used to?
It does take a couple of days to get used to. The best way I think I can explain it is to imagine it's similar to motion sickness, though they say it's different. To me, it felt almost the same with a couple of minor differences. It's a mismatch between your neurovestibular system, which is sensing gravity, and your vision system, which is seeing the scenes around you. So on Earth, as I grew up, the neurovestibular system is always synced up with the visual system. So if I tilt my head and I see the room rotating, and also my otolith responds to gravity and it bends downward, my brain senses the tilt in gravity and it correlates with the visual scene. But now you get up in space and you tilt your head, you see the room change in angular orientation, but you sense no change in the otolith in your neurovestibular system, so you don't sense any directional change due to gravity. And that conflict in your brain as it integrates the scene tends to upset the brain and realize, hey, there's a problem here. And with about half of the astronauts, they experience some sort of symptoms of what we call space adaptation syndrome. I found if you move around fairly slowly and you don't try to exacerbate motions, then the effect is less and you don't feel as queasy. Another thing which told me, in large part, it is physical and mental, but there's some psychological aspects of it, because I realized if I go to my pilot seat and strap in, where I had 1,000 hours in the simulator, and I was very experienced with being in that seat, then my system would calm down, because now I'm sort of in my little crib, or I'm in the womb, the astronaut's womb, and I would always feel better. But as soon as I unstrapped and started floating around, I'd start to feel a little bit queasy. Another thing that tells me it's psychological is if I focus on the task and the technical aspects, which I love anyway, and you work the checklist, then you tended to not think about it. It was only when I wasn't performing a task, I didn't have any duties, and I was just moving around, that you'd feel a little queasy. After about 2 days that passes, your brain begins to understand and be able to integrate the scenes and the feelings and the sensations. And then it's kind of fun and interesting, because then you get some weird, just frankly interesting sensations. So if you think about the space station at that time was about 100 feet long of a tube that you could either translate yourself down the tube with your head forward and like you're flying like Superman.
Yeah.
And it really felt like you're Superman flying over the earth. Or you could stand at the top of the same well, but put your feet down, and your brain would think it's a vertical well, and you're dropping into a well and pushing off the bottom and coming back up to the top. It was the same scene visually, but you could translate your brain into thinking it was two different scenarios.
Wow.
One final one, if I enter a room and let's say I put my sleeping bag, I only use a sleeping bag one time. Most of the time when I slept, I just floated freely without the encumbrance of a sleeping bag. But if you walk into a room and the sleeping bag is mounted on the wall, this looks like the ceiling and this looks like the floor, because that's where my head is. But as soon as I sit down in the sleeping bag with the intention of going to sleep, up is still the ceiling, but as I lie down in the bed, now up is in this direction if I'm sleeping on the earth. And so the whole room, with the intention of going to sleep, the whole room mentally shifts 90 degrees. It's the weirdest feeling or sensation.
It sounds like it must be really
You know, it's a
disorientating.
lot of it is psychological.
Yeah, sure. What about when you came back to
It can be.
Yeah.
I also noticed, I also, two other quick things I noticed on successive missions, the effect is less and less. So there is something about the brain's ability to learn the space environment, and then it just seems normal, and you don't really, I mean, you still have the same sensations, but you don't get queasy is my point.
Wow, amazing.
It was really fun.
And what about when you come back to Earth? Is it then strange to readapt again? Or is your brain like, oh, thank God I'm home?
Yes. No, it is strange to readapt, and the rule of thumb is for each day you're on orbit is a day of rehabilitation. So for me, it was only 2 weeks of rehabilitation. You know, you lose calcium in the weight-bearing bones, particularly the hips. So you can't just go running when you come back down. You have to make sure the bones build back up calcium. If you're in space for a 6-month missions or even a year, now the rehabilitation is 6 months or a year long.
Wow.
But even the neurovestibular sensations and the gains change. So if I come back and I'm holding a glass of water on the Earth, I forget how tightly I must squeeze, and I drop the glass because now I'm in the presence of gravity.
Yeah.
Or when I first got back down on the Earth, the other common symptom that I personally had was when I turned a corner, walking down a hall, and I turned a corner to enter a room, I would always hit the inside shoulder on the door jamb because I wasn't exerting enough energy to get into the door. You know, up in space, it requires very little energy. And so, you know, over a couple of days that begins to abate and you begin to be reacclimated to the Earth's environment.
Wow, that sounds incredible. It sounds very confusing, but an amazing experience.
Yeah, it was great. I just feel very fortunate that I was able to have that opportunity not once, but 6 times.
6 times, amazing. Okay, man, I just have a couple of wrap-up questions for you.
Sure.
So one of them is, I think you mentioned you are a reader.
A what? A reader?
A reader, you enjoy reading?
Yeah. Mostly technical things and operational things.
All right, okay. What's your all-time favorite book, if you have one?
You know, I tend to think of things like there's a couple of things come to mind. One of the all-time best safety books was written by a safety author named James Reason called Managing the Risks of Organizational Accidents. And so he became a friend of mine after I left the astronaut office and became an author. I had an acquaintance with him and developed that kind of a friendship over the years. You know, I like any books that have to do with the mind and how the mind works. So I enjoy reading that. My daughter has lent me a book called, I think it's called maybe Cosmos. I should get the name of the book. I don't want to say it incorrectly, but it's about how humans throughout history, evolutionary history, have looked at the stars and what did they think back in prehistoric times. You know, we see the cave drawings and that kind of thing, and we can infer what they were thinking. And that's pretty amazing to see how the cosmos has really affected people throughout human history and how it has changed. And in fact, the lamentation of the book is that these days we tend to think about those things less and less, and we're too focused on what's going on the earth, and it's to our detriment that we're not thinking about the cosmos and what's out there.
Amazing. I'll need to look that up. If you could send me the name of that book, I'll definitely add it to my list.
If you allow me to just walk over here quickly.
All right, okay.
This is probably not professional, but I have the book okay. Right over here. I can see. It's called The Human Cosmos, Civilization and the Stars by Joe Marchant.
Okay, great. I'll check that out. Next question for you is, do you have a favorite quote?
Favorite what quote?
Quote, yeah.
I guess I don't. There are many that I like. I try to learn from every book I've ever read, or learn from historians and people who think of those kinds of things. I tried to, when I wrote my book, that was one of the things I was conscious about. Not only do you have to have a grammatically correct book, but you also want to have phrases that are interesting that people will remember. And I tried to fill my book with things that people will remember.
Awesome.
I guess kind of a non-answer, nothing comes to mind.
Okay, fair enough. That's cool. I'm really excited to read your book. And I'm going to include a link for it in the bio. So for anyone who's listening to this or watching it, your links will be in the bio. So I know you have your website and people can buy the book from your website, but you're not on social media, I don't think. Are you on any Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or anything?
Yeah, I don't. So my daughter, who's a graphic designer, is trying to convince me to get on social media. I have not grown up in that kind of world. I tend to not do those kinds of things. What I love doing is giving speeches to corporations and having that personal touch and that, being face to face with people. I do a lot of these kinds of blogs now. And by the way, thank you for inviting me.
It's my pleasure.
Because of COVID. So it's a necessity. The only way to reach people is through Zoom and virtually. Mm-hmm. But I would much rather be doing the personal thing. So I don't really, I'm not on social media. Okay. Although my daughter says I should get on social media.
If you ever get on it, you can send me the link and I'll include it in the description. But for the time being, you have your website anyway, so people can contact you, they can read about you, and they can actually buy your book from the website, right?
Yes.
Great. Yes. And last question is favorite movie. Is that a space movie?
Oh, so I have three favorite movies, I guess. A favorite space movie, I would say, is The Martian.
Oh, Matt Damon.
Matt Damon, yeah.
Great.
The reason I like it is unlike other space movies, and by the way, I like all space movies, even the ones that are not physically or technically plausible. Mm-hmm. I like them all. But the reason I like The Martian is because the crew stuck together. When it was time to make the decision to go recover or rescue the Mark Watney character, they made the decision they were going to do it. They didn't have arguments in space. Too many movies, there'll be an argument in space, and I'm thinking, that's not quite the way it really is. You got to stick together if you're in an extreme environment like space. So that's why I like it. And they had to overcome challenges, that kind of thing. But I also like Galaxy Quest, another kind of space movie, a spoof on Star Trek. Mm-hmm. I love Notting Hill, and Serenity, I guess, is another favorite of mine, another space movie. So I guess I'm drawn to kind of the space movies, and kind of in America, they have the Hallmark series of movies that are about love and family, that kind of thing. Those are the kinds of things that I like.
That's amazing.
My brother's a film editor in Hollywood, so I tend to like all movies.
I really like that one, Interstellar. Have you seen that?
I have. Yeah, I like that one too. The thing I loved about Interstellar was Kip Thorne is a world-renowned physicist, and he contributed. And with the budget that they had, they took his theoretical ideas and turned it into visually what a black hole would look like, or a gargantuan star. And he said the physicists learned, they don't normally have the budget to create the visual scenes. They know the mathematics of it. But he said he liked the way they depicted what it would look like if you ever got close to a massive gargantuan star. So that was kind of cool that the physicists actually learned from Hollywood.
That's amazing. Oh, there was one thing I meant to say to you. I totally forgot to bring this up. You were brought into the Astronaut Hall of Fame, right?
Yes.
That must be such an amazing accomplishment, especially considering you wanted to do this since 10 years old, and then you get brought into that.
Yes, and initially when I heard about it, I was thinking, why do we have an astronaut Hall of Fame? That's that's kind of weird. There's so few astronauts in the world. I think I was number 232 that launched off the surface of the Earth of all nations. But I began to realize the importance of the organization. It comes from a group that was started by the Mercury 7 astronauts, and it's a scholarship program to help students in engineering.
Okay.
And so it's a great honor for me to be part of the organization.
That's amazing. Well, it's been a great honor talking to you today. I thank you for coming on and telling us about your book and your expeditions. And I'm really excited to share this. And as soon as it's up, I'll give you an email. But
okay,
thanks a lot
thank
for
you
your
very
time.
much, Ray. Great job. I enjoyed talking to you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Dan. Take care.